I'm going to share with you a very specific type of worldview. And as I share this worldview, what I want you to do is kind of look at it with a fairly critical eye. Okay, so here's a very specific worldview. God created everything we see. Everything physical, the whole physical world was created by God. But because of our rebellion, because we disobeyed God, what was once meant to be good is now all of a sudden evil. So even though God created this world that was good, anything physical is now inherently evil. And because anything physical is inherently evil, the only thing that can actually be good are things that are spiritual. Okay? But there's a problem. The problem that this causes is because we're trapped in these physical bodies which are evil, God wants nothing to do with us, and so because of this, there's this separation that we have from God purely because we exist in this physical form. And so in order to deal with the problem of being separated from God, we have to deal with the problem from a spiritual standpoint. Because what really matters and what really lasts is not the physical world, but the spiritual world. And so the more we are able to distance ourselves from this physical world in whatever means necessary, then we are going to feel more connected with God. Okay, so here's kind of the main issue here. So if everything physical is evil, and the only thing that lasts is spiritual, there's two ways you could go about living this life. One way is to just say, whatever. Because what's physical doesn't last, I will live my life to the fullest. I will experience every pleasure I desire because anything physical I do has no eternal consequences anyway. As long as I focus on my spiritual life, I'll be okay. That's one way to view this problem. Another way to kind of live in response to this worldview is in order to get closer to God, because what's physical is evil, I have to deny everything physical. I have to kill, in a sense, my flesh and control my human nature by, instead of living however I want, denying every desire that my flesh has, and that's going to get me closer to God. And one way to do that is maybe to do these physical acts like baptism or circumcision, okay? And so in order to get around this problem of the fact that everything physical is evil and God doesn't want to come in contact with that, God sends messengers to us as a way that we can connect with him. God will send, for example, angels as a way that we can connect with him. God will also send Jesus as a representative or as a messenger for us to connect with him. Another way that we can get really closer to God is to increase in wisdom and knowledge. But not just any sort of wisdom and knowledge, but this secret wisdom and knowledge, that if we could only tap into it, then we will elevate ourselves to a much higher spiritual plane. And then the more of that knowledge that we can unlock, the more we can start to achieve spiritual perfection. All right, here's the worldview. Okay, can we go all the way to the end of this one? Any thoughts? How does that sound? No opinions. If you really thought about it carefully, there's kind of a lot here that sounds maybe like something we would agree with in the Christian world. Like we would agree God created everything. We would agree with that. But there are a few other things here that are a little bit sketchy. There are things that are maybe half-truths or things that seem like maybe they're biblical, but we should question a little bit, okay? And the reason why I share this particular worldview is this is exactly what was happening in the city of Colossae when Paul was writing his letter to the church of Colossians. The church was not planted by Paul, but he had heard of what was going on in the church. And what was going on in the church is because Colossae was this huge metropolitan area, a lot of ideas were starting to infiltrate the Christian belief system of the church. And some of these things came from Jewish legalism, which was all about obeying the law. And so some teachers were preaching that you have to get circumcised, you have to do these things in order to be saved. You also get Eastern philosophy trickling in from the East. You get this idea of pagan astrology that was looking to the stars and really trying to understand the world not in just the physical sense, but what's happening in the spiritual world. That was entering in. Mysticism was entering in. Asceticism, which is basically denying all your fleshly desires and basically becoming a monk in a sense, right? That was trickling into the church. And in the mix of all that was the truth in terms of the Christian truth that was there. Okay, and so you're getting this mixture, and this is a big problem, right? And so that's why Paul is writing this letter, because there are these false teachers in the church. Gwen, can we not put this up, okay? There are these false teachers in the church, and what they were claiming is, we're not denying the Christian doctrines. We're not denying the Christian truth. What we're doing by bringing in this idea of knowledge and this idea of asceticism is we are actually enhancing your Christian experience. We're adding to it to make it better. Right? We've spoken in the past about this idea of gospel plus, that maybe what we need is not just Jesus, but we need Jesus plus something else. Because if you think about it, in one sense, the truths of Christianity almost seems too simple. Right? And life is very complicated. And so it's kind of scary to simplify life down to these fundamental truths. And so what these false teachers are saying is if you want to get to the next level of living, you need Jesus and more. You need this certain secret knowledge, right? And this happens today in churches. You have that one or two people that are well-intentioned and they want to know the Word of God more, and so they study the Word of God, and then they feel like they discover some sort of truth that maybe nobody else has seen. And what happens is they get so focused on kind of these secret details that they lose sight of the big picture. And instead of their hearts burning with desire to follow God, what happens is they get prideful and they cause all sorts of problems within the churches because they start to question the pastor and they start to question all these things that are being said because they feel like they have the secret biblical knowledge that nobody else has. And that's what Paul is dealing with as he's writing this letter. Okay? So there's two problems. Everyone okay with the background? Today will be more teachy. Okay? So teaching is speaking it and preaching is yelling it. We will just teach it. Okay? Here we go. So here's two problems. First problem is this. The false teachings that Paul is dealing with can sound pretty convincing. Right? Especially, you think about it, you're a new Christian, you've just been kind of initiated into this church, and you're hearing these things without any sort of solid biblical background, and so a lot of non-truths might sound pretty convincing to you. Or maybe you think, oh, the pastor said it, or the teacher said it, so it must be true. All these mixed ideas. I mean, think about in Taiwan. I'm sure in Taiwan, even people who are Christians bring together their Christian belief system along with more traditional belief systems rooted in Buddhism or Taoism or whatever. And it is very essential that we as a people learn to kind of sift out what is biblical and what is not, that we learn to sift out what is essential and what is just cultural, that we learn to discern what maybe as a church we need to be pretty strict about and what we as a church maybe don't need to worry about, right? There's this collision of different beliefs that may or may not sound convincing. One time I spoke at Grace Church, and after the service, this guy was riding the subway, and he's like, oh, I was at the service, and he just said, like, yeah, I really liked what you said. I've been serving God for many years here in Taiwan. I was like, okay, this guy's, pretty good guy. And they said, then I went to the Middle East to serve God. And I said, oh, he's like a missionary. And then he said, God, Allah, Buddha, it's all the same. He said, it's just, there's many paths to God, right? And this to him sounded very convincing. And my first thought was, what the heck? Because it caught me off guard. And my second thought was, well, this guy's not my problem. He's Pastor David Homer's problem, so he'll deal with him later, right? And then we got to our stop, so I never got to talk to the guy. But the point is, there's a lot of things that, if we're not careful, sound pretty right. There's many paths to God. That's so inclusive, right? And so that's what was happening here. So let me do kind of a small social experiment, okay? So what I did is, on Google, I entered in the phrase life mottos. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I feel like there's a lot of philosophies that we live by that we never even question whether or not it agrees with God's word or whether or not it's actually a truth that God would endorse, in a sense, okay? So here's some things that I found on Google. You may find yourself thinking like, oh yeah, I totally agree with that, or yeah, I totally live that life, or that makes sense. I'm not making any judgment on it. I just want to show you that there's kind of a plethora of belief systems. Okay, here's what I found. Life isn't about finding yourself, it's about creating yourself. Sounds pretty good, right? Life is not about finding yourself, it's about creating yourself. Okay, I mean, that's sounds pretty profound. This one was kind of funny. Success is the best revenge, right? Success is the best revenge. In other words, if you want to get somebody back, then be successful and rub it in their face. And that's okay, that's fine. If it makes you happy, then do it. If it doesn't, then don't. Sounds pretty wise. Okay, this one's interesting. Only do what your heart tells you. Now, I want to point out that this is a quote from Princess Diana, and she's such a nice lady that there's no way she could be wrong, right? And so clearly, this is something that we should abide by. Only do what your heart tells you. When you can't find the sunshine, be the sunshine. Pretty good words of wisdom. This is something teachers will love to say. Do what is right, not what is easy. Do what is right. I would put that on a poster in my classroom if the posters actually stuck to those brick walls, which they don't. Okay, respect yourself enough to walk away from anything that no longer serves you, grows you, or makes you happy. Pretty good. Life is what you make it. That's something that we hear all the time. And then lastly, expect nothing, appreciate everything. Now, I'm not saying that these are wrong. Okay, I'm not saying that these are wrong or right. I'm not making any judgment in that. I'm not saying that these are an incorrect way of thinking. But I just want to point out that even today, there's these philosophies, some of which agree very well with God's truth, and some of which actually don't. But yet, it becomes very easy to kind of adopt these inspirational quotes as the way we live life, right? It's just, to some extent, I believe that all truth is from God. And maybe some of these sayings are very valid under certain circumstances in our lives. But at the same time, I want us to see that if we're not careful, a lot of things that sound true may not line up with God's word. And the problem that Paul was dealing with is a lot of the things that were being said probably sound pretty convincing. But the second problem that he was dealing with is that all these false teachings was cluttering who Jesus is. Because there's all these things going on telling people that you need Jesus and more, or you need secret knowledge, or you need to be circumcised, and that begins to kind of clutter the picture of who Jesus is. And every single one of us has to answer this question of who is Jesus. The technical term for that is Christology. So the question we have to answer is, what is your Christology? Who do you believe that Jesus is? And this is one of the most important questions we have to answer, because what we believe determines how we live. And a wrong belief system and wrong theology or wrong doctrine inevitably in some way will lead to wrong living. So for example, I grew up Catholic. Okay? And so I thought that in order for God to forgive me, that could only happen after I confessed my sins to a priest. And up until that point, I had this picture, whether right or wrong, I don't know, I was just a kid, but I had this picture that up until the point when I would confess my sins to the priest, I was carrying around all my sins with me, and so God didn't want anything to do with me, and God was distant, or maybe that God was punishing me. And so everything that would go wrong, I would feel, oh, God's punishing me because I hadn't gone to confession yet. And then when I went to confession, that's when all things were good, you know, after the priest told me to pray for like an hour or whatever it was. And what I realized is because I had an incorrect theology of who God is, that affected the way I related to and lived with God. So it is so critical for us to understand and to answer the question of who is Jesus. And these teachers were coming in and saying, yeah, Jesus is great, but in order to have spiritual fullness, you actually need to have this secret knowledge. You need to do these specific rituals, and then you're going to be able to enjoy true spiritual maturity. Or they're saying that Jesus is not God himself. He's just one of the representatives that God sends. And if you want to talk to God, you could just as easily talk to angels. And so they're saying Jesus is only part of the solution. You need more. Right? And how many times do we hear kind of voices yelling at us you need something more than what you're currently experiencing in terms of your religious experience. You need some new exciting experience, some new doctrine, some new addition to your Christianity, and that's what's really going to help you to mature. So do we see why this is a problem? It is a big problem in the church. And so Paul's main concern is to recenter the church so that they understand that Jesus is not just the starting point, he's the whole point. That the church would understand that he's not just part of the solution, he is the solution. That he's not just one of God's messengers, but he is God. That he's not just, what we need is not truth from outside the Bible, but Jesus himself is truth. And so he's going to go after this false teaching, and the way that he's going to attack the false teaching is he's going to use the very same vocabulary that these false teachers use. But instead of using it according to their meaning, he's going to redefine what it actually means. So, for example, Colossians chapter 1, verse 9 says this, "And so, from the day we heard, we have not ceased praying for you, asking that you may be filled with the what?" Oh, that was so weak, evening service. Let's try it again. That you may be filled with the what? Of his will in all spiritual and... Remember, they were all about wisdom. They were all about secret understanding. And what Paul is saying is the truth and life transformation is not going to come in some secret form. The knowledge that you need is going to come from God. And so what he actually does, if you look at it, he doesn't tell them necessarily they're wrong, but he focuses on God. So he doesn't say, your belief system is wrong because of this. He says, God is like this, and he magnifies God instead of magnifying the problem. Okay, so now we're ready to dive into our text. Here we go. Are you ready? That didn't sound ready. Verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So let's just go verse by verse. So Paul says in verse 15, he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That word image doesn't mean that he's some sort of faded representation or of God. That word image actually means that he is the exact representation of God. And so what Paul is saying is, if you want to know who God is, and if you want to know what God is like, you don't have to wonder. All you need to do is look at Jesus. And so God is not this unreachable, unknowable spiritual entity that wants us to always wonder, what is he like? What are his emotions like? That's not the picture of God. God here very much wants to reveal himself to us, and he does that through Jesus. That's why in John chapter 14, verse 9, it says, Jesus said to him, I have been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Right? So if you want to know what God is like, just look at Jesus. You don't have to wonder. He's not that mysterious. Okay? Now, I want to go back to the verse really quickly. In verse 15, it says, the firstborn of all creation. Now that's a little bit confusing because if you read that without understanding the Greek, it makes it seem like Jesus was what? Born or created, okay? Which lends to the false teaching that he's just one of the many representatives of God. That word firstborn does not mean that he was born literally. It just means he's first in rank. So in everything that happened, Jesus comes first. He is, in essence, deserving of highest honor. Deserving of highest honor. Look at verse 16, 17. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. What's the most repeated word? People are like, what word would you underline if you're doing an inductive Bible study? All, right? And so what Paul is saying is, everything we see, everything we experience was created by Jesus. He's everything. He's not part of the solution. He's everything. He is, let me say it this way. He is the cause of why this universe exists, but more importantly, he is the purpose of why this universe exists. Through him, everything was created, and the part that's kind of hard for us to grasp sometimes, for him, everything was created. He is the cause, and he is the purpose. Verse 19 through 20, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile himself to all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. That word fullness means that all of God's divine power and attributes dwell in Jesus. And that word dwell means that all of God's power and attributes have a permanent home in Jesus. And so what Paul is saying is, nothing needs to be added because in Jesus is everything. All of God is in Jesus. There is no way for us to get closer to God without getting closer to Jesus. There's not going to be some formula. There's not going to be some perfect church you go to in order to get you closer to Jesus. Nothing but Jesus will get you closer to God. No secret knowledge, no ritual. Right? And so what Paul is saying is, we spend so much time looking for something new, and his point is, instead of looking for something new, focus on the truth that you first received from the beginning, and let that be the foundation of everything you do. Focus on what you received from the beginning. John Wesley was famous for preaching the same sermon week in and week out. Same points week in and week out, all about grace, all about forgiveness, things like that, right? You may feel that way sometimes when you hear myself or Pastor Alex, like the same thing, right? So John Wesley straight up preached the same sermon over and over. And people ask, John, why do you keep preaching the same message over and over? And he simply responded this way, I'll stop preaching it when you start living it. I'll stop preaching the same thing once you finally get it. And Paul is essentially saying that when all the fullness is dwelling in Jesus, is the only thing you actually need is Jesus, and then to live out what that means in your life. You don't need anything new. I skipped a verse. Anyone notice? What verse was skipped? No one's paying attention. Verse 18. Here's what verse 18 says. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. Okay, so he is the head of the body. That word head means he is the leader or ruler. And so Paul is making it clear that the church's leader is not this great teacher. The church's leader is Jesus. The church is going to move according not to rituals and not to other things. It's going to move according to how Jesus wants to move his church. Okay? But actually I want to focus on the last word of that verse, because that last word of the verse is the main point that Paul is trying to drive home again and again in this section that we've been studying. And it's that word preeminent. And the entire thrust of this section and the way that Paul is combating all these other teachings that are coming in and cluttering the church's belief system is to remind them and us that Jesus is preeminent. meaning he is above everything else. He is above the universe. He is above any truths that we think are so great. He is above the angels. He is above anything created. He is above the church itself. And so Paul says that his hope in giving us all these descriptions of who God is that we would understand that Jesus is preeminent. And this is the only time that he uses the word to point out to us that Jesus is simply in first place. He's the first in creation. He's the first in the church. He's the first in our salvation. So Paul is saying, take all your fancy truths and your great church programs and your fancy speakers, and none of that matters. And that's why he's able to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." That's it. Obviously, it's hyperbole, it's an exaggeration, but Paul's heart is to say all those extra things that seem so important, all the desire to have a great music team or a great teaching team, that doesn't matter. What matters is that we know Jesus and we put him first. Let's wrap this up, okay? So Paul, in his letters, follows this pattern where what he does is he lays down good theology first before telling us how to live it out. And that's just good teaching, right? He's giving us the basis for why we live it out. He's laying down the truth, and then he tells us how to apply it. Now, clearly, as we've read verses 15 through 20, we are right in the middle of the theology section. Paul's actually not giving us any indication of how to live. He's just really giving us a way to think and understand about who God is so that we have now a foundation of how to live. But I think we still have to wrestle with the same question that Paul was addressing, right? Because Paul's entire message, again, is that look at these things. In creation, in salvation, in the world, Jesus is first. And as simple as it is, the question that I just kind of want to end with, and the question I want us to answer, is that very question: is Jesus first? Is Jesus in a place in our lives where he has the highest honor? Is Jesus the one, the only one we trust for our salvation and our growth and our freedom? Or do we feel like certain behaviors and actions contribute to our freedom? Or do we feel like certain behaviors and actions and rituals contribute to our salvation? Or let me ask us this: is Jesus the first among us in terms of our relationships? Is our relationship with Jesus the most important relationship in our life? Or is it our spouse? Or is it our kids? And when I was single, that was a very easy question to answer. Yes, Jesus is the most important relationship in my life because nobody else loves me, right? But now, if I'm going to be honest, it's a struggle because I look at how much time I spend devoted to my family versus how much time I spend devoted to Jesus, and there's a little imbalance that I don't want to admit. And so the question that maybe some of us have to wrestle with is he the most important relationship that we can put above all else? Does Jesus come first in the way that we make decisions? A lot of us are at a crossroads in life where we have to make some pretty big choices. And so the question that I have for us is, as we're making these big choices, do we consider his glory and his kingdom first? During first service, I'm still in teacher mode, one of the people was kind of struggling with this big life choice of, do I go here or do I go there? What's God's will for me? And part of the reason why I would make a horrible counselor is my immediate response, that I didn't say, but now thinking about it maybe is important, is maybe that question of, do I go here or do I go there, would really be more easily answered if you ask the question, am I putting Jesus first in this decision? And am I making a decision based on expanding his kingdom and putting him in a place of honor, or am I making a decision based on what I think will further my career or my life? And maybe a lot of the difficult decisions we have would actually be easier answered. And I know it's complicated, okay? I'm not saying that life is easy, but maybe a lot of those difficult decisions would better be answered if we ask ourselves, am I trying to live my life putting Jesus in a place of preeminence? And maybe it doesn't matter whether you choose to go here or there. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you're not going to know God's exact will. But maybe that's not the question. Maybe the question is not, what's God's exact specific will for me? But maybe the question we just first need to start with is, am I continually putting Jesus first in all my decision making? Does he factor the most and the most immediate when I think about these things? Is he first in our finances? When we spend our money, is it about him and his kingdom? Or is it about us and our desires? Is he first in the way that we spend other resources like time? Does he get credit for everything that happens in our life? You know, these are difficult questions, but at the same time very fundamental, right? Think about how many times in the Bible God says, if my people would just trust me, then all these things will kind of fall into place, right? And the Bible just has all these invitations for us to put God first and trust him to take care of us. So let me leave you with this thought. It is very scary to put any one person first in your life. It is very scary to put yourself in second place. You kind of feel like you lose part of who you are. And you kind of feel like you're sacrificing a lot by putting someone in first place in your life. But I would argue this, that putting God first actually puts things in the right order. And the reason why I say that is because, remember, all of creation was created by Jesus, and the purpose of creation is that Jesus would be first. And so when we put Jesus first in our decisions, in our relationships, in our lives, we're actually in perfect alignment with how the universe was meant to be. And it's in those times when he's not first that we're actually out of alignment and we're not experiencing life as it's meant to be lived. And so despite the fact that putting someone else's desires and wills above our own may make us feel like that'll make us incomplete, I would argue that you are the most complete when your life is in the correct order as it was intended to be. And I realize that this is not an easy thing to live out, and I realize that it is a process. But hopefully today we can start to identify some of those areas in our life where, if we're honest, God, you are not first. That I want to say it with my lips, but my life speaks otherwise. Can I have the music team come up? So we're going to spend a little time just responding to this question in whatever way God leads you. Is he first? Is he first in my decisions? Is he first in my life? Is he first in my relationships? Someone once said something that has bothered me ever since I heard it, and it's this. Either Jesus is Lord of all, or he's not Lord at all. Either Jesus is Lord of all, or he is not Lord at all. Meaning, if there's areas in our life where we say, yes, God, yes, God, yes, God, no, don't touch this, God, he's not Lord. Because the words no and Lord don't make any sense. And they can't go together. And that's a really difficult truth to kind of grapple with. But I know that God's desire is for us to experience life to the fullness. And the only way for us to experience life to the fullness is to put him first and say, yes, Lord. So can we close our eyes? And I don't know if at any point God just brought to mind very clearly an area of your life that is out of alignment. An area of your life where you're first or somebody else is first or all these other considerations are first, but you know that God is not first. And today, maybe it's just, we just need to take this space to wrestle with that, to begin the process of surrendering those areas that we hold on to, those areas that we have difficulty letting go. And then maybe our view of who Jesus is and how much he loves us and how he desires for us to have joy, maybe that is a bit cluttered at the moment. So let's just take this time as the music team just plays softly to kind of recenter, allow God to recenter us. And then we'll close in a few last songs.